Today is Remembrance Day. Flora Love Katz, a singer, artist, caregiver, and retired civil servant, and friend of CAEF, will lead us in the singing of O Canada. Please stand if you are able. Good day. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of CAEF and co-chair of End Jew Hatred. Welcome to our current program, which commemorates remembrance in several ways. On this day, across the Commonwealth, people are remembering that after the First World War, on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, there was the significance of an armistice. In the US, it's called Veterans Day. For the Jewish people, there are many days of remembrance. For many of our holy days mark the remembrance of murder and martyrdom, of persecutions and pogroms. And every year in Ontario, we have a week of special programming for Holocaust remembrance. Aptly named Holocaust Education Week, beginning on November 2nd, in commemoration of Kristallnacht, and ending on November 9th. And were we to be in a synagogue sanctuary for the opening of this week, we would have paid tribute to the surviving Jewish members of the Canadian military who are annually honored. The video that we are shared with you, and we hope you all got to watch, titled Lest We Forget, is in keeping with the theme of remembering and reinforcing its importance for today. To quote from the online site, My Jewish Learning, it is memory that has allowed us to last through thousands of years of history. Our religion and our people are founded on the collective memory of revelation at Sinai. Scripture throughout commands us to remember. Remember the Sabbath day, observe the Sabbath as a reminder of creation and of the Exodus. Remember continually the Exodus. Remember what the evil Amalek did. The article goes on to remind us to teach history to our children, to never forget, to learn from the past, but also to remember the positive of life and Jewish contributions and teachings, and to bring the past into the future to learn from it, but not to bludgeon others with it. So on this Remembrance Day, we will discuss what has been learned from the Holocaust, how it is remembered by Jews and non-Jews, and how in particular, two special friends of the Jewish people are including the remembrance of the Holocaust and the fight against current anti-Semitism in their life's work. Before I introduce our special guests, I just want to remind you that CAEF is a charitable organization that has no paid staff and functions very efficiently on donations, which we appreciate from all of our friends and volunteers. If you are able to make a year-end donation, no matter how large or small, we'd greatly appreciate this, and ask that you go to our website to donate or to subscribe to our bulletin. Simply go to www.caef.ca. The film Lest We Forget was made a number of years ago, and while it focuses on the most immoral, inhumane act perpetrated on human beings by other humans since the beginning of time, it also reflects on the horrendous damage inflicted on the state of Israel, the Jew among the nations, by a people that has replicated some of the worst Nazi propaganda against the Jews and directed it at Israel. This hatred is more than a political squabble or a land squabble or a border squabble. The Palestinian Authority and Hamas are equally responsible for claiming that every disaster in the world is the result of Jewish evil, that Jews have no claim to the land of Israel. The Jews are in fact a made-up people created by the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And if you think I'm kidding about this ridiculous, vacuous claim, then I invite you to read about it and watch the statements as recorded by Palestinian Media Watch that documents the racist, anti-Semitic, lying treachery that comes from the leaders in the disputed territories and Gaza. Lest we forget demands that we stop saying never again and start saying, stop the hatred now. Stop the incitement, stop the lies, stop the treachery. Stop teaching Arab children to hate Jews and ignoring the facts that this squanders the lives and the livelihood of their own people. I hope you all did get to watch the whole film. I found it difficult to watch in one sitting, but it's got the potential to educate us as to the consequences of what is going on today. Hugh Kitson joins us from London, England. He's been making documentary films for close to 50 years. He has more than 200 production credits and has received over a dozen international awards. And for the last 20 years, he has been focused on making documentaries about Israel. In 2002-2003, he wrote and directed Lest We Forget. In 2006, The Forsaken Promise was released. This documentary film examines Britain's shocking conduct of the mandate over the territory then known as Palestine. It was awarded, Palestine was divided and Jews were awarded their land at the San Remo Conference in 1920. The production of the prequel to From Exile to Restoration followed. All of these films have received international recognition and awards. Blessing, Curse, or Coincidence, produced in 2011, was made primarily for a Christian audience and was based on the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant. It has been translated into many languages and broadcast on Christian TV across the world and received several awards. This was followed by Jacob's Tears in 2015, which was an in-depth look at the spiritual roots of the Nazis. In 2015, Hugh established the company Title Deed Media in Queensland, Australia. The first part of the two-part documentary, Whose Land, hosted by Colonel Richard Kemp, was premiered in 2017 to mark the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, which features the San Remo Resolution of 1920. And as a surprise ending, we will share a moment of that film with you at the end. Malcolm Hedding is a theologian who is one of today's most articulate speakers on the scriptural basis for Christian support of Israel and the Jewish people worldwide. Malcolm has a bachelor's degree in theology and 2 special theological diplomas and worked for many years in the Assemblies of God in South Africa. He was involved in church planting, which is the founding and expanding of churches and church communities for more than 25 years before moving to Jerusalem. He headed the ministry of the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, an organization with which CAEF has a long and proud association. When it comes to allyship with our Christian brothers and sisters, ICEJ and their members have proven to be strong and consistent support. Malcolm was a vocal opponent of South Africa's apartheid regime, while also a vocal supporter of Israel. So he will tell us how both of those views played out for him in South Africa. His tenured term as executive director of ICEJ ended in 2011, but he has continued to be an international spokesperson and to serve on the board of trustees. Malcolm joins us today from Virginia, and I should say he and his wife live part-time in the US, but also have a home in Jerusalem. So welcome to both of you. We will start off with Hugh giving us a bit of a background as to the motivation for his making of the film, Lest We Forget.
Thank you very much, Andrea. because today is Armistice Day, I think it's well worth remembering Allied troops who were involved in liberating the land of Israel from Turkish Ottoman Empire. And, you know, the whole campaign, which started at Gallipoli in the Dardanelles, right up to the time that the Ottoman Empire was expelled from what we know today, what was known then as Palestine, which actually was nothing more than a territory of the Ottoman Empire, and Syria, some 88,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers actually died. And about 19,000 of those were in actually liberating what was then known as Palestine. And without that happening, the Balfour Declaration would have been a meaningless piece of paper, and there would be no state of Israel today. And those involved in fighting included soldiers from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, South Africa, and India. So there was quite a mix of Allied soldiers. And I do believe it's appropriate for us to remember them on a day like this. And then there was another very important campaign in the Second World War. Now, Adolf Hitler, together with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was almost as radical as radical and Islamist as you could imagine, was in cahoots with Hitler, and his plan was to extend the final solution right across the Middle East, not only what was then mandated Palestine, but also into Iraq, where there had been a very large Jewish community ever since the Babylonian exile. And the Battle of El Alamein was absolutely crucial in stopping the Nazis taking the rest of the Middle East and basically murdering all of the Jews of the Middle East. And there were some 22,000 casualties, of which 35,478 were actually killed. The Jewish leadership in the land of Israel at that time were eternally grateful to the Allies, even though Britain actually continued to betray the Balfour Declaration and the mandate. Nevertheless, they were very, very grateful for what the Allies had done at that time. And the leadership in what was then mandated Palestine gave a Bible to Field Marshal Montgomery. And a friend of mine found this Bible, and I believe it's in the Heritage Center at Christ Church in Jerusalem to this day. And inside the Bible, it said, there was the inscription, Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery, the gallant leader of the victorious British forces, by whose hand God has placed salvation in Zion in the days of El Alamein, presented in token of the everlasting gratitude of Palestine Jewry by the Vadliumi Council of the Jewish community in Palestine. And I think it is worth remembering all of the Allied troops who actually stopped Hitler at that time. Now, lest we forget that's a phrase that we hear every Remembrance Day, but the film Lest We Forget that we made some 18 years ago is actually not about the the Allied deaths in World War II and World War I. It's actually about the Shoah, where 6 million Jewish people perished. And these days, there are many who are starting to try and discount that very, very well documented fact. And a friend of ours, when I say ours, because Malcolm knew Johannes Farsius as well as I did, he had the vision for this film, and he wanted to really get across the message about the Holocaust. It wasn't simply remembering the 6 million who died, which does happen quite rightly every year in the West on the 27th of January, and of course in Yom HaShoah in Israel, which is usually in April or thereabouts, depending on how the Jewish calendar falls in relation to ours. But what Johannes wanted to do was to highlight the central message that we were trying to get across. And this message is on a plaque inside the Auschwitz camp. And it's a quote by George Santayana. I don't know a great deal about him, but what it said was, "The one who does not remember history is bound to live through it again." And this is really the central message of what Lest We Forget is all about. And we live in a day of rising anti-Semitism. Now, Lest We Forget had its premiere screening, its proper premiere screening in the Houses of Parliament in London. And that screening was sponsored by a well-known Jewish Labour member of Parliament, Dame Louise Ellman, who's now no longer a member of Parliament. She left the Parliamentary Labour Party in disgust at what Jeremy Corbyn had been doing, but she has since rejoined under the new leadership. But it was an incredible day because we had a number of MPs there, and we had invited the Director General of the BBC, who at that time was a man called Greg Dyke. And we had about 100 leaders from the Jewish community in London also present. So the film, which I guess many of you have seen, which runs about 75 minutes, we showed it in its entirety. And then we had a Q&A afterwards at which Johannes and I stood up to answer questions. By the way, my own role in that film was writer, director, cameraman, and editor. So effectively, I made the film. But we had this Q&A afterwards. Now, while Greg Dyke didn't turn up, he did send one of his underlings and no doubt reported back to him, because those of you who've watched it will see there is a lot of footage from Palestinian Media Watch. There's a lot of footage which the BBC under no circumstances would ever broadcast. And that's the incitement to hatred that we see. And the question was asked of me, why do the BBC not show this stuff? Why are they not impartial enough to actually show what the Palestinians are doing? And my answer was basically that the BBC is anti-Zionist. They hate Zion. And therefore, by being anti-Zionist, you're actually anti-Semitic too. If you hate the Jewish state, then it's also a form of hatred of the Jewish people. Now, at that time, there was a lot of anger in the Jewish community at the way that the BBC was, remember, it's a publicly funded body by an act of parliament. The way that the BBC was covering the second Palestinian Intifada, which is when we made the film. And as a result of that anger within the Jewish community, the BBC were actually brought to account, and they agreed to do an internal report to study their own reporting. And that was entrusted to a man called Malcolm Balin. Now, he finished the report in the middle of the next year, which was 2004, and the report has been kept under wraps ever since then. They've never released it, and under the Freedom of Information Act here in Britain, one would think that they should be compelled to release it, but they've spent something like £300,000, close to 500,000 US dollars, on legal fees and court costs to bury this report. And to this day, it still has not been released. And one can only assume that they have got something to cover up. Their own internal investigation has done that, has found something wrong, and they don't want it to go public. I have to say that their reporting is still, to this day, probably even more so than ever, especially with the series of Gaza conflicts that we've had over the last 10, 12 years. And the last one especially has caused a spike in anti-Semitism in this country. Now, you can't blame the BBC alone, it's the media in general, but it is causing anti-Semitism. And it's, more importantly, it's causing hatred against the Jewish state. So just this week, beginning of this month, a group of pro-Israel organizations here in Britain, including the Zionist Federation, the Israel-Britain Alliance, Christians United for Israel UK, and others, started a campaign as from November the 1st, which is just 11 days ago. And in the first week, some 10,000 people have written to their MPs and also the minister who's responsible for the BBC. And the aim is to get the BBC accountable to the Parliament, because quite frankly, they're a law unto themselves. It's very necessary, I believe, to highlight this truth that if we forget history, and we're seeing it, we're actually starting to see it repeat itself. So really, that's why we made this film and why we're involving this campaign. And I'm involved in actually trying to approach the Parliamentary Select Committee that looks at the BBC. It's got a long name, which I won't go into here, because the Parliamentary Select Committee have the legal power to actually subpoena this report. So it's a question of watch this space.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Hugh. I appreciate that. And now Malcolm to give us your response to the film, the work of ICEJ, and how you educate people, the Christian community, to love the Jews.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea. And it's always a pleasure to serve with my dear friend Hugh Kitson and to be a part of your program today and to support the wonderful work that you are doing. The International Christian Embassy Jerusalem has, from its very inception, resisted anti-Semitism and set out to put the record straight about the history of the Jewish people and the contribution, the remarkable and unending contribution that the Jewish people have made to the world. And in fact, it was for that very reason, because partly we have a history of Christian anti-Semitism that is very troubling. And so the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem opened its doors in 1980 to demonstrate to the Jewish world and to the nation of Israel that there are millions of Christians worldwide who stand up against anti-Semitism, who stand up against the hatred of the Jewish people and stand with you in all respects. And we are very and most appreciative of what has happened in Canada. Donna Holbrook is a very dear friend of mine. She's one of yours, and you know the record of this organization in Canada alone. So I want to say, from my background, as many people know, I am born South African, and I had a unique father. And my father fought in the Western Desert, by the way, Hugh, and fought under General Montgomery, who later became Field Marshal Montgomery. He escaped from Tobruk, and he fought through 5 years of the war, even into Europe. And he volunteered to do that. So it's correct that on this day, for me, I honor my personal history in my father, Guy Usher Hedding, who stood up against the evil of Nazism. And more than that, he was a remarkable individual, because being born in South Africa and he being South African, we were his children. And since we found ourselves living in the apartheid state, my father made sure that we as children never embraced the evil of what we saw in the country. A reminder on this day that fathers, many of whom are veterans, and of course mothers and women, they can play such a crucial part in the lives of young people. As I've said a moment ago, I was born and bred in the apartheid state. The word apartheid is a very emotive word. And that's why today, when it's used in regard to Israel, it has such a powerful drawing mechanism for people. And to equate Israel with the apartheid state actually is an insult, if I have to be honest, an insult to the 30 million Black people in South Africa who suffered under this very brutal and harsh regime. There is absolutely, Andrea, no comparison between the state of Israel today and what took place in the apartheid state. The apartheid state dehumanized the Black people at a level that the world has never seen. I mean, it was an experiment in social engineering that in some respects could be mirrored like the Holocaust. It designated a people to be less than human. And in fact, the apartheid state believed that Black people had inferior brains to white people. So the educational system, which was called Bantu education, was dumbed down in order to satisfy what they thought was the inferior intelligence of Black people. You know, and that is similar to what happened to the Jews in Germany and the way in which the Nazi government portrayed them. You know, they were apes, they were pigs, they were rats, they were vermin. They were less than human. And once you have that psyche, you can abuse people. And that's what happened in South Africa. You can never liken what happened in South Africa to the Holocaust, and we should never do that. But this discrimination of the human being and the robbing of his freedom and rights as a person is at the very root of this evil that we talk about today. And so they had this thing of Bantu education. They excluded the Black people totally and completely from the life of the nation, except to herd them into shanty towns around the big white cities, from which they would be the labor for the apartheid state. I mean, it was shocking, absolutely shocking. And the brutality that went with it was unimaginable. The big cities actually were white by night. If a Black person was caught anywhere in the big cities of South Africa, as the police vans roamed through the suburbs, and they did, they would be arrested, thrown in prison. And to equate this with the nation of Israel and with its Arab community is absolutely wrong. There is no such contrast, not at all. The Arab communities of Israel, being a minority, can go anywhere, do anywhere. We've recently lived in Ramat Aviv, in North Tel Aviv. Actually, I now live on Mount Carmel, in Zikron Yaakov. But there are beautiful beaches in North Tel Aviv. One is called Baruch Tel, the other is called Tzuk Beach. On the weekend, hundreds of Arabs and Israelis pour down to these beaches. They play volleyball together, they braai, they have a barbecue together. There is nothing like that ever took place in the apartheid state. The Arab people are free. They can go to any university, any college. They can move throughout the country. There just is no comparison. And might I say that I understand that Israel is not perfect. We're not here today to somehow suggest that the nation of Israel is angelic. Of course, there are problems and tensions wherever you find nations with minorities. And may I also say that looking at the USA in the last 2 years, there's far more tension, disorder, violence, and chaos going on here in the cities of America in terms of minorities than in Israel. Israel is not an apartheid state. Israel does not have the draconian laws that were introduced by the apartheid government. Israel has never brutalized the Arab communities of the nation, as happened under apartheid. And that has to be stated more than ever, because this term apartheid has now infiltrated the universities, the schools, and the colleges of our Western nations. And young minds are being infected with it. And the idea is, if the initial apartheid state had to be dismantled, then Israel must be dismantled. And the only way you can do that is to make the apartheid slur against the nation of Israel stick. And it is a lie. But there is a global campaign headed up by the BDS movement, and everybody needs to hear this. There is a global campaign headed up by the BDS movement that seeks to discredit Israel, firstly. Secondly, to delegitimize Israel. And thirdly, to dismantle Israel. And sadly, most of all, this movement is supported today by much in the liberal left of the world, on the colleges, the campuses, the universities of the West. And it's based on a lie, a total lie. The conflict that Israel has with the Palestinians is another issue completely. Completely. And that is because we're dealing with an entity that is seeking the total destruction of the Jewish state. In this webinar, it has been stated time and time again that if you listen to Palestinian Media Watch or Memory, the Middle East Research Institute, you will hear what Palestinian leaders, Islamic sheikhs, and others are actually saying to their people in Arabic. And Hugh is absolutely right that the Western media ignores it. And these people are constantly calling for the destruction of Israel. It's not that they want what they already had for 19 years between 1948 and 1967, when they could have established a state, but didn't. No, the goal, and we must have no doubt about it, is the destruction of Israel. And this is what we have dedicated our lives to combating. And I think I have some type of credibility because I was not only born in South Africa, but as an Assemblies of God minister, a Pentecostal preacher, I stood up against the system, preached against it. But at the same time, I was standing with the nation of Israel. There is no equivalence at all between the apartheid state of South Africa and the nation of Israel today. But this slur has become the foundation stone of these movements globally. So anti-Semitism, actually, we need to understand it, has shifted. It's not so much a religious issue driven by medieval Christian theology. While that is still there, but it's mutated into a political issue on the left that has made an alliance with the radical Islamic world for the destruction of Israel. And that's precisely why Hugh is up against a brick wall with the BBC. They will not air anything from the Palestinian Media Watch, from Memory, because they have this anti-Israel agenda. Religious leaders, political leaders, social leaders are buying into the false narrative that Israel is an apartheid state. And that's why I am so grateful that we can stand up today and say this is the truth. You know, in 1994, Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, the first free president of South Africa. At his inauguration, Yasser Arafat was present. After that day, he actually went to speak in a mosque in Johannesburg, which he thought was secure. But he told everyone in the mosque that they should not be concerned about the manner in which he shook the hand of Yitzhak Rabin on the lawns of the White House just a few months before. Because in actual fact, he was using peace as a means to systematically dismantle and destroy the state of Israel. The International Christian Embassy at that time had a copy of that, and we distributed it. But it's amazing how many media outlets said, no, 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 I don't think we can do this. I don't think so. It's a bit too radical. And actually, it's only rhetorical. He doesn't mean it. He's just keeping his constituency on board. Well, another man did that 70 years ago. And everybody said, no, it's just rhetoric. No, it wasn't. He murdered 6 million Jews. We will not let it happen again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. I want to just make a comment, Malcolm, because you've said something most people don't know, but I had read years ago that Mandela was very pro-Arab and hence anti-Zionist. But you can't say that. I've been to events and been shut down for trying to say that because it's really heretical. The other thing people don't know or want to believe is that Desmond Tutu, who is seen as the Bishop of Peace, is also quite anti-Israel and has said so publicly many times, but people will not hear that either. It's interesting how the idea that people are peace-loving is assumed to mean something, that they accept everybody, and nobody appreciates that's not true. And we have serious concerns about some of the Christian movements, so I don't mind saying that with the two of you, that are still quite anti-Zionist. And in Canada, the United Church, I think, continues to stand against Israel in its support for BDS, which is really tough for some of us to understand. It's the largest Protestant movement in the country.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think what we are seeing today, number one, which again is not well reported, that we have one of the greatest movements across the world of multiple millions of people from the new evangelical world, and you now meeting them in Canada, who actually are standing up.
Right.
And it's a theological conflict that they are distancing themselves from. And so while you get these historical churches still standing on what we call replacement theology, the fact of the matter is, in many cases, their churches are dying and dwindling.
True.
It's true.
It's true.
I'm not judging it. I know I travel throughout the world.
Right.
But the world that supports Israel in the evangelical and Pentecostal fraternities is actually growing like you cannot believe. And therefore, we should be encouraged. You know, the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, believe it or not, has a global constituency of 14 million people. How do we know that? Because in the year 2000, we held a petition amongst our family, our constituents throughout the world, that Jerusalem should remain the eternal, undivided capital of the Jewish people. That petition drew 14 million endorsements.
Wow.
I gave it to the mayor of Jerusalem, not all 14 million, but a document that was audited that said, you can check this, who at the time was Ehud Olmert. So here you have one organization that's kept an embassy in Jerusalem since 1980, in solidarity with the Jewish people, that has the capacity to reach 14 million people. We are not alone. All of us, we will stand up against anti-Semitism. And we need to know that today.
We do. And I thank you for that on behalf of everybody that has tuned in and those who have who will see this. We have over 5,500 people in our little circle, and we will definitely make sure they all receive this video, this program, which is being recorded. Everybody will get a video. And I should mention, some people have passed on questions, and I will get to those in a moment. Hugh, maybe you can speak about two things that I think people are interested in. Is how did you invite, secure, work with, approach Holocaust survivors to participate in a video, in a film that must have been painful for them? I found it hard to watch. It must have been hard for you to get these people involved.
Well, two of them we were introduced to, and someone involved in the production actually organized those interviews. The one with Yolanda Landau and the other lady whose name I'm afraid has just escaped my memory, but another interviewee, a man called Lance Lambert, who both Malcolm and I know very well. He was a good friend to both of us, and he passed away a few years ago. We had a personal connection with, and actually when we shot that interview, I learned things about him that I didn't know before. One of those being that he had lost so many in Auschwitz, and what was the second last train to go in from Hungary, and he lost 58 members of his extended family, including his grandmother and his father. And he actually contributed a very great deal. And for those of you who've watched it, you'll probably remember him talking about the media as well, because that is fueling the conflict. If the media were impartial and truthful, then I do believe that that would go a long way to cooling down the anti-Israel rhetoric.
Yes, I think the media provide fuel to the fire, right? And it's also true in Canada, I should say, for our Canadian audience, that we see some of that with our own CBC runs very biased anti-Israel stories on a regular basis, as do some of our traditional newspapers. My question to you, Malcolm, is what do you see as the steps to be taken between Jews and Christians to combat anti-Semitism? How can we do more together?
I think we need to broaden out our relationship together. I think a lot has been done through various organizations like those that Hugh represents, Christian Friends of Israel, Bridges for Peace, International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, CUFI. And I think, number one, I think that more Jewish people and Israelis need to know that we are your trusted friends. There's always this little question, that this is not a true, there's a hidden agenda here. But actually, if you look over the years of these organizations, they've been absolutely faithful. And some of their leaders have already passed on. So we need to broaden out and have a trust and a respect for each other in a new way, because we need each other. We need each other. And secondly, I think what we're doing today, Andrea, is so important. And really, we really thank you for being the mind behind this type of educational webinar, where people can speak together, we can educate, we can tell people how to get resources. So we need to broaden out this type of activity and find more room to do that. There are many other groups who would willingly join us, like Stand With Us and all these groups that are getting up, and we need to really broaden out the educational capabilities we have. And finally, to be honest with you, I think we need to have what I call visibility gatherings. Now, in the Gaza war or the Lebanon war years ago, when there was I think 2006, there was this whole, it also spiked anti-Semitism throughout the world. And the capitals of Europe, we had people marching against Israel and accusing Israel of all sorts of things. And we decided at the Christian Embassy that we should get our people out onto the streets actually with Jewish people and Israelis and everybody. And, almost to every big city in Europe, we mobilized visibility campaigns. In other words, the idea was, if you think you're coming for the Jewish people in this community, if you think you can hate on them and attack them in any way, if that's what you're thinking about doing and that's happening, well, you first have to get through us. Because here we're on the street.
I think maybe we need that kind of direct action again. So we'll be in touch about that.
Well, that's what has to happen, you see, because they're on the street anyway, and being on the street, they owning the message of the street.
Correct. Yes.
So there needs to be visibility on the street.
That's
And
true.
I'm dead serious about it. We saw what it did in Copenhagen. We saw what it did in Paris. We had a huge meeting, Hugh might have remembered, in London. And we went throughout the world, wherever we could. We mobilized our branches to get our people out on the street.
I think
And we had banners.
Right. And we're not
Touch
waiting.
the Jews, you touch us.
It shouldn't be just after there's a tragedy and then
No.
wait everybody together to have a vigil and we're all very sad and light a candle. You're right. We need to be proactively on that.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
Those are my thoughts.
Yeah.
Hugh, you've done a lot of work to bring the story of Israel, the truth about Jews forward. Can you say something to our audience about where they can see your films, what you're working on now as well?
Well, you've got Lest We Forget up on your website, and it's also on our website, which is www.whoseland.tv. And you can also see something about a series that we're currently doing, which is looking at the legitimacy of Israel in international law. And in Whose Land, we've interviewed so far 7 or 8 international lawyers as well as historians. And the film is hosted or anchored by an ex-British Army officer who many of you will know, called Colonel Richard Kemp. And he's a staunch advocate for Israel. And he's also a military expert. He understands the conflict from a military point of view. So you can see those on our website. And then there are other films which are mainly aimed at a Christian audience, and you can go to the website of hatikvafilms.com, and you can see a number of other films that I've made over the last 20 or so years.
Okay, great. Just before I get to a couple more questions, perhaps I could ask our David Stambler, our IT guy who's standing by, to show the brief piece we have on Whose Land with Colonel Kemp.
The documentary film Whose Land is not intended to justify the right to exist of the State of Israel. I find such an argument abhorrent. Questioning Israel's right to exist is pure anti-Semitism. Such fundamental prejudice should not be dignified by a response or contrary argument. How often is the right of Great Britain to exist called into question, or the United States, Germany, France, China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, Iran, any other country? How often is the right to exist of any country other than Israel questioned, argued over, debated, discussed? To do so is exceptional. Exception applied only to the Jewish state. It therefore amounts to anti-Semitism, pure and simple. In Nazi Germany, the right of Jews to own businesses, to own property, to join the professions, to go to school, to receive medical treatment, to live a normal life in the community, all of these were denied them. Today, Israel's enemies demand that the Jewish state be isolated, ostracized, banished from the community of nations. These people are the Nazis of the 21st century. Their arguments must not be dignified with a response. These modern-day Nazis are responsible for the greatest slur campaign in the history of humanity, spreading false narratives, falsifying and distorting history, lying, deriding, rejecting and despising without cause and for one purpose, to abolish the nation state of the Jewish people, Israel, whose land does not set out to justify the right of Israel to exist. Instead, it simply tells the truth, a truth that is clear, undeniable and unequivocal, a truth that for the sake of human civilization and decency must be heard above the growing cacophony of those who clamour to turn the world against the Jewish state, and whose false propaganda not only maligns the innocent and brainwashes the unwary, but also incites violence and inflames hatred.
So everybody pay attention. We are going to bring you that film, that documentary as well, but it is available now through Whose Land TV. Malcolm, I want to ask you a really tough question. When I was organizing this webinar, I'm going to be really frank, because people know I am. I approached a number of people to speak with us to join the panel. And one of the reasons I believe several people declined was because they're really afraid to say some of the things that you two have said and portrayed in this documentary. And one of them is what Colonel Kemp just said, which is the language that is used today is similar to that of what the Nazis used in Germany. Can you say more about that? Because if we said the Palestinian leadership were the inheritors of Nazism, we would be thrown out of the room. But I'm saying it. Am I right? Is there more to it? What do you think?
No, the history of it is certainly like that. And what's happened over the decades, they've tried to whitewash the real intentions of the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, and they've tried to somehow cleanse their history and rewrite it. And so anything that contradicts that is persona non grata. They will not accept it because they have an agenda. And you know, to be honest with you, there are many people that I've met, that I've spoken to over the years, who've said, well, I know that Israel's cause is right. I know that everything you say is exactly how it should be, and you tell the truth. But then they'll say to me, but you know, the nation of Israel is going to bring the world to a total conflict. And maybe it's expedient that the Jewish people give up their state and surrender to the wider Arab agenda. And there is this thought, and it was expressed even by the Obama administration here in this vein, that it is a colonial experiment. It's part of the colonial expedition that subjugated people all over the world. So it's this narrative now that they're building in to the saga, that this is an apartheid state, and the saga of BDS and all of these things. So it's all designed to delegitimize the Jewish state. And that's what's behind it. And you are right. And I know I'm right. Colonel Kemp is right. Hugh is right. I know many, many wonderful men who are right when we put our finger on the root of this problem. And we have to stand up and we have to take the heat. I mean, there came a point in my life where I had to stand up in South Africa against the system. And because I could no longer live with my conscience. And when you do that, you pay a price. Eventually, I had to leave the country. They were going to detain me without trial.
Wow.
So there is a price to pay. And the problem is that many of the people that we speak to know we tell the truth, but they're not prepared to pay the price for it. And some of the reasons is they have huge Islamic populations now in their Western capitals voting for government, and they know without them, they're not going to rule and reign.
And these people may end up being the rulers. That's right. They will be elected and they will bring their attitudes with them.
Yeah, so it's called appeasement.
Mm. At the end of Lest We Forget, Johannes concludes the film by saying, evil prevails when good men do nothing. And so therefore we must stand up for what is right, what is fair, what is just, and what is true.
Well, you two have been exemplary in that regard, and we're very proud to know you and to work with you and to support the work that you're doing. And we thank you for what you're doing. And I personally look forward to doing more with you. And I invite our listeners to also reach out to their Christian evangelical Zionist friends and find ways to collaborate. I would definitely encourage that. And perhaps, Malcolm, we can talk further. Maybe you want to say something about how people can do that. I think it's hard for a Jewish person to approach a Christian and ask for that kind of support.
Absolutely. And so I think that's why they need to reach out to organizations that have a solid track record. And I would invite the Jewish community everywhere in the world, in fact, to go to the website, for instance, of the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem. And that'll direct them to their local country, if there's a branch in the country, which there is in Canada. And they know that they can then go onto a website of true friends, people who care about them, who love them, and are prepared to defend them. And I think, given the online world we live in, that frees them from approaching a person personally, which can be a little embarrassing. But to get onto a website of Hugh and the ministry he has, and these other websites like the ICJ and many others, enables them to know, look, I'm looking up a friend here. Right. So do come and seek us out.
Okay, great.
Know your friends.
I thank you from the bottom of my heart and from everybody that's here. And we will close this webinar with another beautiful singing by our friend Flora Love Katz. So please stand for Hatikva. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, be well, take care, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.